I'm going to turn things over to Rachel Klein. Rachel is going to talk to you all a little bit about the Help Copays Act.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am Rachel Klein. I am the Deputy Executive Director of the AIDS Institute, and I'm also a steering committee member for the All Copays Count Coalition. And we have been working on the Help Copays Act now for a few years. This all started about, I don't know, let's go back about 10 years. And over the past 10 years, I think a lot of folks will notice that your health insurance costs have been going up. And not just your premiums, but the annual deductibles that you have to pay, as well as the cost sharing, the co-payments or co-insurance that you have to pay, particularly for prescription drugs. All of these costs have been going up for people. It's really not uncommon these days for people to have deductibles of several $1,000s that they have to meet before their health insurance will start paying the cost of their care. And then once you've sort of met that deductible, if you are a person with a chronic illness and you are reliant on a specialty medication, those medications, there have copays or co-insurance that may be as high as 50% of the list price of the drug. Now, there are some protections that the Affordable Care Act put into place that would cap the amount of money that people have to pay out of pocket with those deductibles and co-insurance or co-payments each year. But the Help Copays Act is here because there's a problem with how health insurers and PBMs are designing the plans that sometimes make it really hard for people to hit those out-of-pocket caps, even when they have really high healthcare costs. So if you can go to the next slide. The issue that the Help Copays Act is designed to address has to do with copay assistance. So a lot of us who have chronic illness or have a family member who has a chronic illness rely on copay assistance that you get from either a charitable foundation or from a drug manufacturer to help you meet that deductible and the co-insurance amount for your prescription drugs. And more as these healthcare costs have been going up over the past decade, patients with chronic illness who rely on specialty and high cost brand drugs have been turning to copay assistance so that they can afford to get their drugs. The problem is that about 5 years ago, health insurance plans and PBMs started making these policies where they just decided that they weren't going to count the amount of copay assistance that people were using toward their annual deductible and out-of-pocket max. And they called this a Copay Accumulator Adjustment Policy. So we, along with several other organizations that have now make up the All Copays Count Coalition, started hearing from patients that this was happening. And what it means is that, when a patient goes to the pharmacy, let's say it's January or February, early in the year, they get a refill for their prescription, they fill that prescription, they've got their copay assistance. Sometimes it's a card that you use, sometimes it's automatic if you're enrolled in the program, and sort of on the back end, that copay assistance gets applied. You get your prescription drug and you go home and that's fine. However, when the amount of that copay assistance isn't counted toward the deductible and out-of-pocket limit, at some point during the year, copay assistance can run out, right? It's not designed necessarily to be used for a whole year. And so patients were going to the pharmacy in the middle of the year, maybe April or June or August, and they were told by the pharmacist that they had to pay their deductible and the co-insurance or copay for the drug in order to get their drug refill. And so people often don't have several $1,000s that they can pay in 1 month in order to get a drug refilled. And so they would go away without their medication. There's a couple of different ways that these sort of policies get implemented. In addition to being called a copay accumulator adjustment policy or a copay accumulator, sometimes plans have done something called a copay maximizer, and this is mostly in the employer market. If you have insurance through your employer, where the employers have more flexibility with regard to what they have to cover. So there's something called an essential benefits package, and prescription drugs are deemed to be an essential benefit. But not all employer plans, especially those large employer plans that are self-insured, sometimes called ERISA plans, they don't have to meet the same requirements for coverage of the essential benefits package that the marketplace plans, the individual and the small group plans have to meet. So what we started hearing about is that some employer plans were covering prescription drugs, but then they would decide that specialty drugs were not essential and then not count the value of copay assistance that was used to pay the deductible and the out-of-pocket costs. So sometimes in these maximizer programs, they will set the copay amount at the amount of the assistance divided by 12 so that the copay assistance does last the whole year, but sometimes they don't do that. They're really designed to maximize the amount of copay assistance that the patient gets and uses, even though, and the plan keeps it, even though they're not counting it to those out-of-pocket limits. You can go to the next slide. So that's the problem that the Help Copays Act is designed to address. We have two provisions in the Help Copays Act. The first one says pretty plain and simply that any payment that is made by or on behalf of a health insurance plan enrollee has to be counted toward their deductible and out-of-pocket limit. And that really addresses the copay accumulator issue. The second provision goes to that maximizer question that I just raised, and it just says that if an employer plan does cover something that is otherwise part of the essential benefits package, like prescription drugs, they can't just decide that only some of them count. If you cover any prescription drugs, then all prescription drugs that you cover have to be considered essential, and those patient protections apply. So we have gotten a pretty good response on the Help Copays Act this year. Last year was the first year that the Help Copays Act was introduced, and it was introduced in the House of Representatives, and it generated some co-sponsors, but it was never moved forward. It didn't end up having a hearing or a markup or any part or actually get enacted into law. So this year, we have a bill that has been introduced in both the House and the Senate. And in the House, there are 55 co-sponsors. It was introduced by Representative Carter and Barragan, Miller Meeks, DeGette, Fitzpatrick, Clark, and Watson Coleman. So we started off with a good bipartisan bunch, and we now have 55 co-sponsors that are still bipartisan, but leaning rather heavily Democrat. And I'll talk about why that's an issue in a moment. In the Senate, it was introduced by Senator Marshall and Kane with Murkowski, Markey, and Ernst. Again, a very bipartisan group. And we now have 12 co-sponsors, and they are very evenly matched. There's 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans. If you go on to the next slide. And in addition to being introduced into both the House and the Senate, the bills have been part of a markup in both the House and the Senate about PBM reform, pharmacy benefit manager reform. And that was very exciting because this is as far as we have ever gotten with these bills. Now, in both chambers, the amendment was offered to the PBM package, but then withdrawn. And that was because of, in the Senate, some procedural issues, and in the House, because we didn't have the votes to get it attached to the package. So it was offered and then withdrawn so that it didn't fail in a vote. So where we are right now is that we need more co-sponsors. We need more co-sponsors in both the Senate and the House. And in the House, we're particularly focusing on getting more Republicans signed onto the bill so that it remains very clearly a very bipartisan bill. And actually today, the All Copays Count Coalition is doing a lobby day that's really focused on the Senate. And in July, we're going to do another one that's going to focus on House members. And I hope that all of you will join us for that. And they will be virtual. We're doing it virtually today, and we're going to be doing it virtually in July so that people can participate from wherever they are. It is so important that members of Congress, both in the House and the Senate, hear from patients in their district who have been subject to a copay accumulator or a copay maximizer policy. We know it's really disruptive for people, and they really need to hear those stories, and they are very, very powerful. And I'm right now very, very jealous of Alyssa's map. I wish I had a map for you so that I could show you where the current co-sponsors are. And that's definitely something I'm going to develop and make sure that we put up on the All Copays Count website. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. We really, really need this bill to pass. Patients are really suffering right now because when they can't afford their out-of-pocket costs, they walk away without their drugs. It's not like when you go to the hospital and you have a really high payment for a hospital bill that you get the care first, and then you can negotiate the payments on a payment plan later. If you need a prescription drug and you can't afford it, then you walk away without your drugs. Go on to the next slide. We've been getting a little bit of pushback. Obviously, the insurance companies and the PBMs are not a big fan of this bill. And so they've really been talking to members of Congress about how it's going to raise drug prices and raise insurance costs. And that's simply not true. We did an analysis of premiums in states that have passed similar legislation and found that there was no increase in premiums in states that have passed this kind of a bill. Also, it's really important to note that copay assistance is not subverting insurers' ability to do utilization management, to do prior authorization or step therapy like Alyssa was talking about. This happens after the PBM and the insurer have decided what drugs are covered on the formulary, after they have subjected patients to prior authorization, to step therapy, other utilization management, and controlling access to specialty medications. At that point, when the patient is actually prescribed a specialty drug, that's when the copay assistance kicks in. And it's really the only purpose of that is to help make sure that the patient can actually go home with the drug that they need. I'm going to go ahead and, I think we've sort of talked about this, that it really doesn't have anything to, it's not going to raise prices. It's not going to, change the way health insurance works. This is copay accumulators and maximizers are a really new phenomenon. There's something that insurers just kind of made up out of whole cloth. And all we're saying is that, when patients need to get access to drugs that are life-saving, that they're paying for health insurance, and the health insurance should provide, that care. So if you go ahead and move on to the next one. We have also been active in states, and we have now 19 states that have passed legislation very similar to the Help Copays Act, as Alyssa was talking about. That's fabulous, except that states don't have jurisdiction over all health insurance plans. So even when a state has passed one of these laws, you might still have a copay accumulator or a maximizer if you work for a large employer and you get your health insurance through one of those large employer plans. So we're really excited about the progress that we've made, 19 states plus DC plus Puerto Rico, and we will keep pushing to get more states that have these laws in coming years, but hopefully we'll be able to pass the Help Copays Act and we won't need to do this by state anymore. So I think I've got one more thing. This is a whole bunch of resources that I put together, that if you would like more information about either about how copay accumulators work, about Help Copays Act, or talking points that you can use in conversations with your members of Congress, you can go to any of these resources. And I also listed the All Copays Count Coalition's website so that you can go there and get all the information you need. And of course, I think the next slide just has my contact information. I'm happy to talk to anybody about this subject. When my kids were at home during the pandemic, they heard me talking about copay accumulators all day long, and they burst out laughing every time they hear me say it, because I feel like it's the one phrase that I have said more than almost anything else in the last few years. So hopefully we'll pass this bill soon, and then we can all stop talking about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel.